My family decided that the $120,000 down payment for my new house should go to my older sister. Yes, the same sister who abandoned her two children for a flashy boyfriend and now suddenly needed a luxury condo to match her new lifestyle. I was 6 months pregnant, sitting at our post-church Sunday dinner, listening to them casually give away my life savings. I did not scream, I did not beg. I just looked at them and said they could have the money on one condition. When I told them what that condition was, every self-righteous smile in the room vanished. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, 6 months pregnant, and a senior data analyst. Somehow, I am still healing from the wounds my family inflicted. As a successful woman, I tried to escape their toxicity but maintained contact out of a misplaced sense of duty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and felt entitled to your hard-earned success. Growing up in our household meant maintaining a flawless illusion for the public. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, Sister Yvonne, treated our family image like a sacred relic. Every single Sunday, we wore our tailored clothes, smiled warmly, and pretended we were the absolute perfect church family. Behind the closed oak doors, the reality was suffocating. My older sister, Chloe, was the undisputed golden child. At 35, she was breathtakingly beautiful, highly charismatic, and allergic to accountability. She was the star my parents loved to parade around. I was the reliable one, the workhorse, the one expected to fix everyone else's problems while remaining invisible. The expectation was always that I would quietly support the family from the shadows while Chloe soaked up the spotlight. This dynamic reached its breaking point on what was supposed to be a normal Sunday afternoon. My husband Andre and I came over for our traditional post-church dinner. The dining room table was heavy with my mother's cooking. The scent of roasted chicken and collard greens filled the air. I was exhausted, feeling the physical toll of my third trimester, but I had shown up to keep the peace. I had just set my fork down when my father cleared his throat and tapped his crystal water glass. The room fell silent as Pastor Calvin put on his authoritative voice. He looked directly at me and announced that the $120,000 in our family joint savings account would be withdrawn the very next morning. My heart stopped. That was not family money. That was my money. When I started making real money at 26, my mother ruthlessly guilted me into putting my savings into a joint account with her. She claimed it was to protect my assets before I eventually got married. It was a brilliant manipulation tactic I was too young to see through. I spent 6 grueling years working overtime and skipping vacations to build that fund. Andre and I were closing on our first house in a few weeks, a beautiful home where we planned to raise our baby. I stared at my father, waiting for him to finish his sentence. I assumed he was releasing the funds so Andre and I could make our down payment. Instead, the words that came out of his mouth shattered my entire reality. He proudly stated that the money was going to fund a luxury condo in the city for Chloe. I sat, frozen hands resting on my pregnant belly. Chloe sat across the table, swirling her wine glass with a smug expression, perfectly comfortable stealing my future. Beside her sat Trey, her new boyfriend. Trey was slick, loud, and wore clothes that screamed new money. He was a known scammer with no verifiable income, but he knew exactly how to flatter my parents. "You are giving my money to Chloe?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. My mother immediately jumped in, her tone defensive and sharp. She insisted that it was family money, ignoring the fact that every single deposit came from my paychecks. She said Chloe had been through a rough time lately and needed a fresh start. A fresh start. The phrase echoed in my mind and made my blood boil. "You are taking $120,000 of my hard-earned money," I fired back, my voice rising. "The money you tricked me into putting in a joint account. And you are giving it to a woman who just dumped her 2 young children on her ex-husband Jamal so she could play house with a scammer." The silence in the dining room was deafening. My father slammed his hand on the table, demanding respect. But the truth was out, and it was ugly. Chloe had literally walked out on Jamal, a hard-working warehouse manager who adored his kids, just because she found family life boring. She abandoned her own flesh and blood to chase a flashy lifestyle with Trey, and now my parents were rewarding her for it with my life savings. Chloe did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She took another slow sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto mine with chilling indifference. "You are being completely selfish, Naomi," she said. "You have Andre to provide for you. He makes good money and your baby is not going to starve. Trey and I need a high-status place in the city to network. We are building a brand. You would not understand because you have always been so basic." She then had the audacity to invoke our culture to justify her theft. "As a successful Black woman, it is your duty to uplift your family," she continued, leaning forward. "It is the Black tax, Naomi. You made it, so now you owe us. You should be proud to elevate your sister." Trey nodded in agreement, flashing a gold-toothed smile. He added that the luxury condo was an investment in the family's image, ignoring the fact that he was contributing absolutely nothing to this investment. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to correct her, to defend me, to show even a fraction of the morality they preached every Sunday. Instead, my mother nodded in agreement. She told me God blessed me with a good job so I could be a blessing to my sister. She said Chloe needed this condo to maintain the family's respectable image. In their twisted minds, protecting Chloe's facade of success was more important than my actual hard work. They were willing to sacrifice my home, my baby's future, and my financial stability just to keep up appearances for their church friends. They would rather rob their responsible daughter than admit their golden child was a broke, deadbeat mother. The sheer disrespect in that room was suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, the betrayal burning in my chest. Beside me, Andre had heard enough. I felt the heat radiating from him. The chair legs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as Andre stood up. His jaw was clenched tight, his fists balled at his sides. He was a calm, patient man, but watching his pregnant wife being robbed by her own parents was his breaking point. He was fully prepared to flip the heavy dining table and tear Trey apart right there in my parents' formal dining room. But I could not let him do that. I could not let them turn this around and paint us as the aggressive ones. In this family, justice was never handed out freely. It had to be carefully orchestrated. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over Andre's clenched fist. I squeezed his hand silently, pleading with him to trust me. He looked down at me, his eyes full of protective rage, but he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. I took a deep breath, smoothing my maternity dress. I picked up my napkin, gently wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly next to my plate. The room was tense, everyone bracing for a screaming match. They expected me to cry, to beg, to throw a tantrum like a child. Instead, I gave them a calm, cold smile. "Fine," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You can have the $120,000. Chloe can have her luxury condo." My parents exchanged relieved glances and Trey grinned, thinking they had won. Before they could celebrate, I leaned forward, locking eyes with my sister. "But you get the money on one condition," I continued. And the moment I told them exactly what that condition was, the smug satisfaction vanished from their faces, replaced with dread. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. The satisfying slap of the heavy paper hitting the dining table made my mother flinch. I slid the folder across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of my sister. Chloe stared at it like it was a live snake. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing that arrogant edge from just moments before. "That is a legally binding contract," I explained, keeping my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "I had my lawyer draft it yesterday when I first suspected you were all planning to raid my account. It outlines my exact terms for handing over the $120,000. First, you must sign away all of your legal parental rights to Jamal, full physical and legal custody. No visitation rights, no alimony claims. You legally surrender your children to the man you abandoned them for." The dining room erupted. My mother shrieked, pushing her chair back so violently it crashed into the antique china cabinet. "How dare you!" she screamed, her face contorting with absolute rage. "How dare you ask your own sister to abandon her flesh and blood on paper? You are a wicked, jealous girl. Chloe is a mother. A mother who left her two toddlers with a struggling warehouse manager so she could live in hotel rooms with a man who does not even have a real job." Andre shot back, his deep voice cutting through my mother's hysterics. Do not lecture my wife on parenting when your golden child has not seen her kids in a month. I placed a calming hand on Andre's knee. My mother was hyperventilating, pointing a trembling finger at me, but I did not blink. I was not finished. There is a second part to the contract. I continued, turning my attention to my father. Pastor Calvin sat rigidly, his face completely unreadable. $120,000 is only 30% of the condo price. To secure the remaining 70%, the bank needs a guarantor. Since Chloe has no income and Trey is completely unbankable, you and Mom must co-sign the mortgage. You will use the deed to this house and your church pension as collateral. The silence that followed was absolute. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. I watched my father pale as the gravity of my demand settled over him. I was asking them to risk their entire livelihood, their home, and their retirement just to fund Chloe's delusion of grandeur. You are out of your mind, my mother gasped, clutching her chest. We will not put our house on the line for this. We told you to give her the down payment. We never agreed to mortgage our own lives. Then Chloe does not get the luxury condo, I said, simply leaning back in my chair. And tomorrow morning I will transfer my money to a secure account that none of you can access. It is your choice. You want to pretend your eldest daughter is a successful high society woman. You want to show her off to the congregation and pretend she did not destroy her family. Then you have to pay the price of admission. Put your house on the line or admit to your entire church board that Chloe is broke, homeless, and leeching off her pregnant sister. I watched my father closely. I knew exactly which buttons to press. Pastor Calvin was a man built entirely on pride and public perception. He was terrified that the church congregation would find out his golden child was actually a massive failure. If the church elders discovered Chloe had abandoned her family and was entirely destitute, his pristine image as a moral leader would shatter completely. He would lose his influence, his status, and the admiration he craved more than anything else in the world. Since I was 10 years old, the best, most expensive dresses were strictly reserved for Chloe to wear in the front pew of the church. I was always forced to wear her faded hand-me-downs and sit in the back rows entirely out of sight. I learned early that in this family, justice is never given. It is orchestrated. I had to maneuver them into a corner where their own toxic pride would become their downfall. My father looked at the paperwork, then at Chloe, and finally at Trey. The internal battle was written all over his face. He was terrified of losing his home, but he was even more terrified of public humiliation. Calvin, tell her no, my mother pleaded, grabbing his arm tightly. We cannot risk the house. We cannot risk the church funds. But before my father could respond, Trey leaned in and whispered into Chloe's ear. His eyes gleamed with pure greed. Trey did not care about Chloe's children. To him, Jamal and the kids were just baggage dragging down his lifestyle. He wanted that luxury condo, he wanted the prestige of a high-rise building in the city center, and he wanted it for free. Babe, just sign it, Trey muttered loud enough for us to hear. You do not want Jamal coming after you for child support anyway. We are starting fresh, new life, new city, no baggage. Let him have full custody. We are building an empire and we need this condo to do it. Your parents have plenty of money. They can co-sign. They will not lose the house because we are going to be rich soon. Chloe hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. The promise of luxury, the allure of avoiding all maternal responsibility, and the sweet validation from her scammer boyfriend were too tempting. She looked at our parents with crocodile tears welling in her eyes. Mom! Dad, please, Chloe begged, clasping her hands together. If you do not sign, I will have nowhere to go. Jamal changed the locks on me. I cannot go back to that cramped suburban house. I belong in the city. Trey is about to close a massive real estate deal, and we just need this condo to host investors. If you co-sign, we will pay you back in 6 months. I swear. Do not let Naomi ruin my life just because she is jealous of me. I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of her statement. I was a senior data analyst, happily married, owning my own home soon, and pregnant with a child I actually wanted. But in Chloe's mind, I was the jealous one. My father rubbed his temples, feeling the immense weight of the situation. He looked at my mother, whose fury at me was slowly being replaced by her blinding devotion to Chloe. My mother had spent her entire life shielding Chloe from the consequences of her own terrible actions. To deny her now would mean admitting her parenting had produced a monster. "We will do it," my father said finally, his voice hoarse. He refused to look me in the eye. "We will co-sign the mortgage. But you are a disgrace to this family, Naomi. Extorting your own parents. Forcing your sister to give up her children. God will judge you for this wickedness." "God has nothing to do with this," I replied smoothly. "This is basic economics. You wanted my money. I gave you my terms. The paperwork is right there." Chloe snatched a pen from her designer purse. Without shedding a single genuine tear, she hastily scribbled her signature across the custody relinquishment forms. She signed away her rights to her children with the same casual indifference one might use to sign a credit card receipt. She did not ask for weekend visits. She did not ask for holidays. She simply threw away her children for a luxury apartment. Trey patted her back, grinning like a predator who had just secured his next meal. My mother watched Chloe sign, a brief flash of pure horror crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a hard, defiant glare directed at me. She convinced herself that I was the villain, that I had forced Chloe into this tragic sacrifice. "Hand over the routing numbers," my father demanded, sliding the signed papers back across the table toward me. "We will meet at the lawyer's office on Wednesday to finalize the mortgage guarantee and the property transfer. You better have those funds ready to wire, or I swear I will ruin you." I picked up the manila folder, checking to ensure Chloe's signature was marked on every page. It was perfect. I carefully placed the folder back into my tote bag, securing the clasp. "The funds will be ready," I promised, standing up from the table. Andre stood beside me, his large frame casting a shadow over my parents. He said absolutely nothing, but his profound disgust was palpable. The next morning, the city was draped in a heavy gray mist. I drove to the industrial side of town, pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown diner. It was miles away from the upscale neighborhoods my parents frequented, ensuring absolute privacy. I walked inside, the bell above the door ringing sharply. Jamal was already sitting in a back booth. He looked absolutely terrible. At 36, he was a hardworking warehouse manager, a man who built his life around providing a stable foundation for his family. Now he looked like a man drowning. Deep, dark circles bruised the skin under his exhausted eyes. His work uniform was rumpled, and he stared blankly into a chipped mug of black coffee. Chloe had left him drowning in a sea of credit card debt she had secretly accumulated in his name. She abandoned him with rent he could no longer afford, on a single-income childcare costs that were suffocating him, and the emotional wreckage of explaining to two crying toddlers why their mother was gone. I slid into the sticky vinyl booth across from him. He offered a weak, exhausted smile. "Hey, Naomi," Jamal said, his voice raspy and defeated. "Thanks for coming. I know you are busy with the baby coming. I just really needed someone to talk to. Chloe completely blocked my number. The bank is calling about the missed car payments. I do not know how I am going to keep the house for the kids." I did not offer empty platitudes or generic sympathy. I reached into my bag and pulled out the crisp manila folder I had guarded with my life since Sunday dinner. I placed it on the formica table and slid it directly across to him. "Open it," I commanded gently. Jamal frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans before carefully opening the folder. His exhausted eyes scanned the first page. He stopped breathing entirely. He flipped to the second page, his hands beginning to tremble violently. He saw Chloe's aggressive, hasty signature at the bottom of the legal custody surrender forms. He saw the official notarized stamps. He saw the absolute, legally binding relinquishment of all her parental rights, physical custody, and financial claims against him. "Naomi!" Jamal choked out a single tear, spilling over his lower lid and dropping onto the table. "How did you get her to sign this? I have been begging her to at least sign a temporary custody agreement so I could get the kids on my health insurance. She refused just to spite me. How did you do this?" "I bought her out," I stated plainly, taking a sip of the ice water the waitress had dropped off. "I offered her the down payment for a luxury condo with Trey, strictly on the condition that she legally release you and the kids forever." She signed it without a second thought. You are completely free, Jamal. You have full legal control. She can never come back and try to rip those kids away from you when she inevitably ruins her life with Trey. Jamal covered his face with his calloused hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the overwhelming force of his relief. He wept openly in the diner booth, the crushing weight of his endless anxiety lifting off his chest. He was a genuinely good father, and now his children were entirely safe from Chloe's toxic influence. But the relief was incredibly fleeting. Jamal suddenly wiped his face, his expression morphing into pure, unadulterated panic. He looked around the busy diner as if he expected my father to emerge from the kitchen. "Wait," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Pastor Calvin, you know exactly how much pride he has. You know how obsessed he is with the family image. If Chloe realizes she made a mistake or if Trey dumps her, she will run crying straight to your dad. Pastor Calvin will absolutely destroy me. He has the entire church bankroll behind him. He has the fancy lawyers on retainer. If he decides to take me to court to get his grandchildren back, just to save face in the community, I cannot fight him. I cannot afford a legal battle against his deep pockets. He will crush me, Naomi." I leaned across the table, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. I needed him to understand exactly what was about to happen. I needed him to know that the reign of Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne was rapidly approaching a catastrophic end. Jamal listened to me very carefully. I said, my voice radiating an icy, unbreakable certainty. "You do not need to worry about my father's deep pockets ever again. You do not need to worry about his expensive lawyers or his pristine church reputation." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the righteous justice of my plan solidifying in my mind. I gave them exactly what they asked for. I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, precise whisper. "I set the wire transfer this morning. They think they won. They think they just financed Chloe's dream life. But they have absolutely no idea what they just triggered. By the time I am done with them, they will not have a single dime left to pay a lawyer. They will not even have a house to sleep in." I tapped the manila folder sitting in front of him. "File those papers with the family court today," I instructed, standing up from the booth. "Take your kids, change your phone number, and prepare to watch the empire fall." Across town, completely oblivious to the legal bomb I had just helped Jamal drop, my sister Chloe was busy living out her fantasy. She and Trey were touring the crown jewel of the downtown real estate market, a stunning $600,000 luxury penthouse condo. The unit boasted wraparound floor-to-ceiling windows, sweeping views of the city's skyline, and imported Italian marble floors. It was the kind of pristine, ultra-modern space designed exclusively for wealthy professionals without young, messy children. It was exactly the kind of sterile, high-status environment Chloe believed she inherently deserved to inhabit. She paraded through the sunlit living room like a conquering queen, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished stone. Trey strutted right behind her, acting every bit the self-made tech billionaire he desperately pretended to be. He wore an aggressively flashy, tailored suit paired with a ridiculously oversized gold watch that I knew for a fact was fake. He constantly checked his phone, pretending to review urgent stock portfolios and offshore wire transfers while loudly boasting about his imaginary investment firm. The real estate agent, a thoroughly exhausted woman named Melissa, trailed behind them with a tight smile. Melissa had been trying to conduct a standard property tour, politely explaining the building amenities, the homeowner association fees, and the strict rules regarding the private rooftop terrace. Chloe and Trey interrupted her at every single turn. When Melissa attempted to show them the state-of-the-art smart home security system, Trey actually snapped his fingers in her face and told her to skip the boring technical details because his staff would handle all the manual labor. Chloe was equally insufferable. She complained loudly that the primary bedroom closet was simply too small for her extensive seasonal designer wardrobe. She openly mocked the high-end kitchen appliances, haughtily informing Melissa that she and Trey exclusively dined out at five-star restaurants and had no use for an oven. Whenever Melissa gently tried to steer the conversation toward the actual logistics of the sale, specifically the mandatory income verification documents and the necessary credit checks required for a $600,000 mortgage, Trey would smoothly deflect. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming his wealth was tied up in complex cryptocurrency portfolios, and that his future father-in-law, a highly respected community pastor, was handling the minor administrative paperwork. Melissa clearly saw right through their hollow facade, recognizing the unmistakable stench of a scammer, but the promise of a massive commission check kept her silent. While Trey continued to berate the agent over the exact shade of white paint in the guest bathroom, Chloe grew bored. She wandered away from the tour, stepping out onto the expansive glass balcony overlooking the bustling city streets below. She pulled out her phone, deciding that the massive sum of money I was supposedly surrendering was simply not enough to satisfy her insatiable greed. Back in my apartment, I was sitting quietly. I was calmly reviewing the encrypted offshore bank routing numbers my parents were using to hide their embezzled church funds. My phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. The screen lit up with a rapid-fire barrage of text messages from Chloe. I opened the thread and read her demands, feeling absolutely zero surprise at her sheer audacity. She did not start with a greeting or a simple thank you. Her first message was a direct, unapologetic demand for an additional $15,000. She claimed the condo needed custom imported silk drapes because the city glare would ruin her. When I did not immediately respond, the text turned vicious. She told me she knew I was hoarding extra money in my savings account. She demanded I empty it entirely because she deserved to live in absolute luxury while I settled for a mediocre suburban existence. Her thumbs must have been flying across her screen because the insults escalated rapidly. She cruelly mocked my pregnant body, calling me bloated and frumpy. She typed that since I was doomed to be a boring, overweight suburban housewife pushing a minivan, I should at least be useful and fund the lifestyle of a sister who actually knew how to maintain her beauty. She ordered me to stop being so pathetic, to know my place in the family hierarchy, and to strictly stay in my lane. She ended her unhinged rant by reminding me that it was my absolute privilege to elevate her social status. I sat perfectly still, reading her venomous words while rubbing my swollen belly. A year ago, those cruel messages would have sent me into a spiral of depression and self-doubt. I would have cried, questioned my own self-worth, and desperately tried to appease her to keep peace. But today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I did not type out a furious paragraph defending my marriage or my body. I did not point out the tragic irony of a homeless, unemployed woman calling a successful data analyst pathetic. I simply typed a single decisive sentence and pressed send. The wire transfer will be ready at the lawyer's office. I tossed the phone aside and returned to my spreadsheet completely unbothered. I knew her arrogance was a fragile house of cards, and I was about to summon a hurricane. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID flashed with my mother's name, Sister Yvonne. I let it ring 3 times, allowing her anxiety to build before calmly answering. I did not even get the chance to say hello before her sharp, authoritative voice completely dominated the line. She was not calling to check on my pregnancy or to thank me for financing her favorite daughter's luxury dream home. She was calling to issue a strict, non-negotiable directive. Naomi, listen to me very carefully. My mother commanded, her tone laced with absolute disdain. Your father and I have discussed the situation regarding Chloe's new home. We have decided that it is absolutely imperative you do not attend Sunday service this week. In fact, you are strictly forbidden from stepping foot inside the church sanctuary until the wire transfer for the condo clears the escrow account on Wednesday. I leaned back in my chair, pressing the phone to my ear. Why is that, Mom? I asked, intentionally keeping my voice perfectly innocent and devoid of any underlying sarcasm. Because we simply cannot risk you ruining this blessing with your toxic jealousy, she spat back without a single ounce of hesitation. Chloe is finally getting the beautiful, high-class life she truly deserves. Trey is an ambitious, successful man who is going to elevate our family name in the city. Your father and I are making a tremendous sacrifice by backing this mortgage, and we will not have you sitting in the pews radiating bitter, jealous energy for the entire congregation to see." She paused, letting her harsh words sink in, fully expecting me to crumble under the weight of her maternal rejection. When I remained completely silent, she continued her merciless lecture. "You have always been so envious of your sister Naomi. You have always resented her natural beauty and her divine favor. We know how petty you can be. If you come to church, you will just sit there pouting, trying to draw attention to your pregnancy to steal Chloe's spotlight. We will not allow you to embarrass this family during such a triumphant moment. You will stay home, you will pray for a more generous spirit, and you will make absolutely certain that your bank releases those funds without any complications. Do you understand me?" The sheer level of projection and delusion in her voice was almost fascinating to witness. She was actively protecting a daughter who had abandoned her children while fiercely berating the daughter who had done everything right. She was terrified that my mere presence would somehow disrupt the fragile illusion of perfection they had crafted for the church community. She wanted me banished out of sight and out of mind until my financial utility had been fully exhausted. "I understand perfectly, Mom," I replied smoothly. My voice did not shake. My breathing did not hitch. I maintained an absolute unbreakable calm that I knew would deeply unsettle her. "I will stay far away from the church this Sunday. I would not dream of interfering with the grand illusion." My mother paused, clearly thrown off balance by my immediate conflict-free compliance. She had braced herself for a tearful argument, for a desperate plea for her love and validation. My cold acceptance left her with nothing to push against. "Well," she stammered, her authoritative tone wavering for a fraction of a second. "Good. See that you do. Just focus on transferring the money. That is your only responsibility right now." She disconnected the call abruptly, the line going dead in my ear. I lowered the phone, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. They were so utterly blinded by their own greed and their desperate obsession with status that they could not see the massive trap snapping shut right around their ankles. They thought they were banishing me to protect their golden child. They had no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead, meticulously orchestrating a spectacular downfall that would echo through their beloved church for decades. They wanted me out of the way. I was more than happy to oblige. It gave me all the uninterrupted time I needed to finish tracing the exact path of their embezzled charity funds and prepare the final devastating blow. Wednesday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. The upscale real estate attorney had his office located in a sleek, glass-paneled high-rise building in the absolute most expensive financial district of the city. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, my heels clicking softly against the immaculate marble floors of the lobby. I wore a simple tailored maternity suit, choosing to fade into the background. I took the express elevator up to the 40th floor. When I entered the plush mahogany-paneled conference room, the suffocating stench of my family's arrogance hit me instantly. My parents had arrived early, and they were already putting on the performance of a lifetime. Pastor Calvin was dressed to the nines in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed unearned wealth. Sister Yvonne sat beside him, draped in a highly expensive designer silk dress, her wrists heavy with gold jewelry. They were holding court at the massive, polished conference table. They were actively boasting to the real estate attorney a stern-looking man named Mr. Sterling. My mother was loudly proclaiming what an absolute blessing her eldest daughter was to the community. She went on and on, weaving a completely fabricated narrative about Chloe being a highly successful entrepreneur who was merely expanding her massive portfolio. Chloe sat directly across from them, soaking up the unearned praise like a sponge. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors and a pristine white suit, looking incredibly bored by the legal proceedings. Trey sat next to her, completely engrossed in his phone, ignoring the attorney entirely. When I walked into the room, the joyful, boasting atmosphere died instantly. My mother glared at me, her eyes flashing with a sharp warning to remain silent and invisible. I did exactly that. I walked over to a leather chair in the far corner of the expansive room, deliberately distancing myself from the main table. I sat down heavily, resting both of my hands protectively over my pregnant belly. I did not speak a single word. I simply watched the inevitable disaster unfold. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he organized the towering stack of legal documents. He directed his attention to my father, his tone shifting into a professional serious register. He explained that purchasing a $600,000 luxury penthouse required substantial ironclad financial backing. He noted that while the initial down payment of $120,000 was supposedly being provided today, the remaining 70% mortgage required absolute security. Because Chloe had no verifiable income and Trey possessed a credit history that the attorney politely described as complicated, the bank demanded a bulletproof guarantor. I sat in my quiet corner, watching my father puff out his chest. Pastor Calvin nodded solemnly, acting as though he were a billionaire philanthropist generously granting a minor favor. He proudly declared that he would personally guarantee the loan. As Mr. Sterling began to slide the thick stacks of paper across the polished table, my mind drifted back to a painfully vivid memory. I was 18 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of college financial aid forms. I had earned a partial academic scholarship, but I was exactly $5,000 short for my freshman year tuition. I had begged my parents to simply co-sign a small student loan. I had shown them my meticulously calculated repayment plan. I had promised to work 2 jobs to cover the monthly installments. I just needed their signatures to secure the funding. My parents had flatly refused. My father had looked down at me with utter contempt, stating that responsible adults do not take on debt for frivolous pursuits. My mother had chimed in, claiming that co-signing a loan was a foolish financial risk, and that I needed to learn how to rely strictly on myself. They told me to delay college and work in a fast food restaurant until I could pay out of pocket. They abandoned me over $5,000 of educational funding. Yet here they were 17 years later, sitting in a luxury high-rise, eagerly preparing to sign their entire lives away for Chloe. They were not co-signing a small educational loan. They were legally binding themselves to a massive high-interest mortgage for a woman who had never held a steady job in her entire life. They were risking total financial ruin, not for education, not for survival, but strictly to fund a fabricated lifestyle of extreme luxury. Mr. Sterling picked up a silver pen and pointed to the first document. He looked directly at my father, ensuring he completely understood the absolute gravity of the situation. The attorney explained that the bank required hard collateral to secure this level of high-risk financing. Pastor Calvin was required to sign a deed of trust that heavily leveraged his fully paid-off suburban home. If the monthly mortgage payments on the penthouse were missed, the bank would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on his personal residence. Furthermore, because of his age, the bank also demanded a massive personal guarantee against his church pension fund. If the house did not cover the full default amount, the bank would legally garnish his entire retirement savings. Any rational, sane human being would have stopped right there. Any normal person would have looked at those terms and immediately walked away from the table. But my parents were not rational. They were deeply toxically obsessed with maintaining their illusion of superiority. My father did not hesitate. He did not ask to review the interest rates. He did not ask Chloe how she planned to make the massive monthly payments. He simply reached out, took the silver pen from the attorney, and began to sign. I watched his hand move across the paper. Stroke by stroke, he signed away the home I had grown up in. He signed away the financial security he had spent his entire life building. He signed away his sacred church pension, the money he had slowly accumulated from the offerings of his devoted congregation. He did it all with a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face, truly believing he was cementing his legacy as a powerful, wealthy patriarch. Sister Yvonne leaned over and patted his arm affectionately. She looked at Chloe with a sickening amount of pride. She was absolutely thrilled. She envisioned the fancy dinner parties they would host in the penthouse, the wealthy church elders they would invite over, and the endless bragging rights she would secure among her social circle. She was perfectly happy to mortgage her own future if it meant she could continue to live vicariously through Chloe's fabricated success. Trey finally looked up from his phone, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He watched my father sign the final guarantee with hungry eyes. Trey knew exactly what he was doing. He had manipulated my parents flawlessly, playing on their desperate need for status. He was securing a $600,000 asset without putting a single penny of his own money on the line, and he was doing it using my parents' absolute stupidity as his shield. Chloe clapped her hands together, letting out a sharp, annoying squeal of delight. She thanked my father profusely, calling him the greatest dad in the entire world. She promised him that she and Trey would make him so incredibly proud. The sickening display of fake gratitude echoed loudly in the sterile conference room. I felt a wave of profound nausea, but I kept my face entirely blank. I rubbed my pregnant belly, focusing on the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing. Mr. Sterling gathered the signed documents, tapping them neatly against the table to align the edges. He placed them carefully into a thick leather folder. He then turned his attention toward my corner of the room. The air shifted instantly. The boasting ceased. My parents turned to glare at me, their eyes filled with impatient greed. Chloe smirked, adjusting her designer sunglasses. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The bank guarantees were signed. The collateral was legally locked in. The only piece missing was the initial down payment to release the keys. "We are ready for the funds now, Naomi," my father said. His voice was cold, carrying that familiar demanding authority he used to subjugate the congregation. "Do not keep us waiting. We have celebratory lunch reservations to get to." I slowly stood up from the leather chair. I felt the weight of my pregnancy, the ache in my lower back, and the exhausting burden of carrying this toxic family on my shoulders for over a decade. I walked over to the massive mahogany table. Every eye in the room was locked onto me. They expected me to hand over a certified cashier's check. They expected me to surrender my life savings, walk away in absolute defeat, and allow them to revel in their stolen victory. I opened my simple maternity tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out my mobile phone. I was absolutely ready for this. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, tapping his pen against the leather folder holding my parents' financial death warrant. "The seller requires the $120,000 deposit to be wired into our escrow account immediately," he stated, sliding a card with routing information across the table. "Once verified, the keys will be released and the transaction formally recorded." My father leaned forward, eyes locked onto my phone like a predator. Sister Yvonne smirked. Chloe vibrated in her seat, clutching Trey's arm, envisioning her custom silk drapes. I picked up the card, studying the numbers. I did not hesitate or offer dramatic apologies. I simply unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. I navigated to the joint account holding the money my parents coveted. The screen illuminated my face. I typed the routing number, the account number, and entered the transfer amount of $120,000. The bank required secondary authorization. A text message with a 6-digit code appeared. I entered it into the verification field and hovered my thumb over the confirmation button. "Are you going to do it?" Chloe snapped, her patience exhausted. I pressed send. A bright green checkmark materialized, accompanied by a notification that the wire transfer had been successfully initiated. I turned the phone around, placing it flat on the table. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, inspecting the screen. He gave a sharp nod. "The transfer has been initiated," he announced, closing his folder with a snap. "The funds should reflect in our account shortly. Congratulations, the condo is officially yours." The conference room erupted into pandemonium. Chloe let out a shriek, throwing her arms around Trey and kissing him. Trey pumped his fist in the air, shouting something obnoxious about empires. He immediately reached into a sleek bag and produced a bottle of expensive champagne. He had completely anticipated this victory. He popped the cork right there in the upscale legal office, the loud crack echoing off the glass walls. Champagne spilled over the rim, dripping onto the pristine marble floor, but nobody cared. My father let out a booming laugh, clapping Trey on the back as if he were a triumphant war hero. Sister Yvonne immediately pulled out her phone, taking a rapid-fire series of photos of Chloe and Trey holding their newly acquired keys. She was already drafting the caption for her social media accounts, making absolutely sure the entire church congregation knew about her daughter's massive real estate acquisition. Nobody offered me a glass of champagne. Nobody thanked me for providing the life-changing sum of money. I was instantly rendered invisible, discarded, the very second my financial utility had been exhausted. I sat quietly in my corner chair, watching them celebrate their stolen victory. They were so blinded by the sparkling illusion of wealth that they failed to notice the subtle mechanical coldness of the transaction. They did not realize that a standard wire transfer of that magnitude, especially one originating from a flagged account, would never clear instantly. They did not understand the intricate, unforgiving algorithms of federal banking security. They just drank their champagne completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb I had just planted directly under their feet. Sister Yvonne finally turned her attention back to me. Her face was flushed with absolute victory. She looked down at me, her eyes filled with cold maternal dismissal. "Well, Naomi," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you have done your duty. You provided the necessary funds just as a good sister should. You can leave now. We are going out for a celebratory lunch at the country club, and it is strictly for the new homeowners and their guarantors. We do not need your dark cloud dampening our joyous occasion." I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my maternity suit. I picked up my tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at my father, who was busy admiring the shiny brass keys. I looked at Chloe, who was already ignoring me taking selfies with her champagne glass. I looked at Trey, who offered me a wicked, arrogant wink. I did not say a single word. I simply turned and walked toward the door. As I reached for the heavy brass handle, Chloe called out to me. Her voice was laced with pure, unadulterated venom. "Oh, and Naomi," she sneered, "do not bother coming to the housewarming party. It is an exclusive guest list, and your minivan does not exactly fit the aesthetic we are going for." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of their raucous celebration. I stood alone in the corridor for a brief moment, letting the profound silence wash over me. The deed was signed. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. I walked toward the elevator bank, pressing the down button. The descent from the 40th floor was swift and silent. When the polished metal doors slid open at the lobby level, I walked straight out through the revolving glass doors. The crisp, fresh city air hit my face instantly. The morning mist had cleared, leaving a biting wind that felt incredibly clarifying. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the cold air. I walked down the sidewalk, blending into the crowd of downtown professionals. I was just an anonymous woman in a maternity suit. But inside, I felt like a towering titan. I had dismantled decades of abuse and toxic narcissism with a single digital transaction. Half a block away from the building, I stopped near a bustling coffee shop. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my phone. I stared at the blank screen, waiting. I knew exactly how the banking algorithms functioned. I knew the thresholds, red flags, and security protocols. I had spent the last 4 weeks meticulously structuring this exact moment. I had traced my parents' offshore church funds. I had linked their illicit transfers directly to the joint account I had used for the down payment. I had intentionally poisoned the well. I felt a vibration against my palm. The screen illuminated with an urgent notification from my banking application. I unlocked the device, my eyes tracking the bold red text that spanned across the screen. "Transaction suspended for review. Federal anti-money laundering protocol triggered. Account frozen pending investigation." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The sheer beauty of the trap was its absolute, automated certainty. By using a flagged account tied to their embezzled funds, I had forced the federal banking system to halt the transfer. The $120,000 would never reach the developer's escrow account. The money was locked in a digital purgatory, completely inaccessible. But the true genius of the plan lay in the collateral damage. Because the wire transfer was officially suspended under federal investigation, the real estate attorney would be legally obligated to notify the bank holding the mortgage. When the bank realized the down payment was frozen due to suspected money laundering, they would immediately flag the entire transaction. They would look closer at Trey. They would look closer at the source of funds. And most importantly, they would trigger the catastrophic default clause on the personal guarantee my father had just signed. Pastor Calvin had legally bound his home and his church pension to a fraudulent transaction. When the deal inevitably collapsed, the bank would seize his assets to cover the immense legal penalties and breach of contract fees. He had signed away his entire life for a down payment that would never arrive. And because the federal authorities were now actively investigating the accounts, his long history of embezzling church donations was about to be dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. He would lose his house. He would lose his pension. He would lose his pristine reputation. He would lose his congregation. He would lose absolutely everything. And Chloe, the golden child, who had literally abandoned her children for a luxury penthouse, would be left homeless, broke, and tied to a scammer whose entire fabricated empire was about to disintegrate. I slipped my phone back into my tote bag. The cold wind whipped my hair across my face, but I did not feel the chill. I felt warm. I felt powerful. I felt completely and utterly free. I hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address to my suburban apartment. I had a husband waiting for me. I had a baby on the way. I had a beautiful, authentic life to return to. The empire of Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne was burning to the ground in a high-rise conference room, and they were too busy popping champagne to even smell the smoke. I leaned back against the leather seat of the taxi, watching the city skyline fade into the distance, and I let out a long, satisfied exhale. The drive home was an exercise in suffocating tension. Andre gripped the leather steering wheel of our sedan so tightly his knuckles turned a translucent white. The streetlights of the city flashed across his face, highlighting the deep, angry scowl etched into his features. We traveled in complete silence for the first 10 miles. He was waiting for me to explain, waiting for a punchline to what had to be a sick joke. When the silence finally became too heavy to carry, he erupted. 6 years, Naomi? Andre snapped, his voice vibrating with a dangerous mix of betrayal and raw fury. 6 years of skipped dates, skipped vacations, and clipping coupons. We ate rice and beans while your parents dined at steakhouses. We drove beat-up cars while your sister paraded around in leased luxury vehicles. You let your mother bully you into putting your paycheck into a joint account, and today you just handed it all away. To Trey, to Chloe. You gave away our house down payment to the very people who have tortured you your entire life. I kept my eyes trained on the passing traffic. I did not raise my voice or rush to defend myself. I knew exactly how bad it looked. From the outside, I appeared entirely broken, a spineless victim of lifelong family manipulation, yielding to their final, ultimate demand. Andre, please, I said softly, resting my hand on my stomach. Just wait until we are inside our apartment. I promise you, everything will make absolute sense. Make sense, he repeated, letting out a harsh, humorless laugh. Your sister literally just abandoned her 2 toddlers to go live in a luxury high-rise with a man facing multiple fraud charges. Your father, a supposed man of God, just agreed to leverage his paid-off home and his sacred church pension to facilitate her deadbeat lifestyle. And you funded the down payment. There is absolutely no universe where any of this makes sense. We are having a baby in 3 months. We desperately needed that money. I did not argue. I let him vent his entirely justified rage. He deserved to be furious. He had stood by my side through every family crisis, every emergency loan they demanded, every tearful night I spent, wondering why my parents could not simply love me the way they loved Chloe. He had earned his anger. But his anger was about to turn into absolute awe. We pulled into our apartment complex and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut behind us, Andre tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and turned to face me, crossing his arms over his chest. He was demanding an explanation, refusing to take his shoes off until I provided one. I did not speak. I walked straight to my home office setup in the corner of our living room and powered up my work laptop. I am a senior data analyst for a major fintech firm. My entire career is built on identifying patterns, tracing digital footprints, and uncovering financial anomalies that people desperately want to keep hidden. My parents always dismissed my career as boring computer work, never truly understanding the level of access and skill I possessed. I typed in my encrypted password, bypassed the two-factor authentication, and opened a highly secure classified financial dossier I had been compiling for the past month. I turned the laptop around and pushed it across the desk toward Andre. "Look at this," I instructed, tapping the bright screen. Andre let out a heavy sigh, clearly annoyed by the detour, but he leaned over the desk. His eyes scanned the top of the document. I watched his face closely. First there was profound irritation, then his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He leaned in closer, his eyes darting back and forth across the rows of highlighted data routing numbers and offshore transfer logs. He scrolled down to the second page, then the third. The righteous anger that had been radiating from him for the past hour vanished entirely. It was replaced by a stunned, absolute silence. He looked at the screen, looked at me, and then looked back at the screen. He slowly sank into the rolling office chair, his mouth slightly open in pure shock. "Naomi," he whispered, his voice stripped of all its previous fury. "Is this real? Are you telling me that your parents are actually doing this?" "It is very real," I replied, crossing my arms defensively. "I noticed the first major discrepancy exactly 4 weeks ago, when I was reviewing our joint savings account statements for our mortgage pre-approval. I dug much deeper. It took me a full week to bypass their shell corporations, but I traced every single dime. What you are looking at is the true source of their wealth. And more importantly, it is the exact reason why I just agreed to wire $120,000 into a federal escrow account under their names." Andre stared at me, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. A slow, incredulous smile began to form on his handsome face. He finally understood the brilliant trap. He understood that I had not surrendered our savings. I had completely weaponized them. "You are terrifying," he said, pulling me in for a tight, relieved embrace. "And I have never loved you more." The conference room erupted into pandemonium. Chloe let out a shriek, throwing her arms around Trey and kissing him. Trey pumped his fist in the air, shouting something obnoxious about empires. He immediately reached into a sleek bag and produced a bottle of expensive champagne. He had completely anticipated this victory. He popped the cork right there in the upscale legal office, the loud crack echoing off the glass walls. Champagne spilled over the rim, dripping onto the pristine marble floor, but nobody cared. My father let out a booming laugh, clapping Trey on the back, as if he were a triumphant war hero. Sister Yvonne immediately pulled out her phone, taking a rapid-fire series of photos of Chloe and Trey holding their newly acquired keys. She was already drafting the caption for her social media accounts, making absolutely sure the entire church congregation knew about her daughter's massive real estate acquisition. Nobody offered me a glass of champagne. Nobody thanked me for providing the life-changing sum of money. I was instantly rendered invisible, discarded the very second my financial utility had been exhausted. I sat quietly in my corner chair watching them celebrate their stolen victory. They were so blinded by the sparkling illusion of wealth that they failed to notice the subtle mechanical coldness of the transaction. They did not realize that a standard wire transfer of that magnitude, especially one originating from a flagged account, would never clear instantly. They did not understand the intricate, unforgiving algorithms of federal banking security. They just drank their champagne, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb I had just planted directly under their feet. Sister Yvonne finally turned her attention back to me. Her face was flushed with absolute victory. She looked down at me, her eyes filled with cold maternal dismissal. "Well, Naomi," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you have done your duty. You provided the necessary funds just as a good sister should. You can leave now. We are going out for a celebratory lunch at the country club, and it is strictly for the new homeowners and their guarantors. We do not need your dark cloud dampening our joyous occasion. I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my maternity suit. I picked up my tote bag and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at my father, who was busy admiring the shiny brass keys. I looked at Chloe, who was already ignoring me taking selfies with her champagne glass. I looked at Trey, who offered me a wicked, arrogant wink. I did not say a single word, I simply turned and walked toward the door. As I reached for the heavy brass handle, Chloe called out to me. Her voice was laced with pure, unadulterated venom. "Oh, and Naomi," she sneered. "Do not bother coming to the housewarming party. It is an exclusive guest list, and your minivan does not exactly fit the aesthetic we are going for." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of their raucous celebration. I stood alone in the corridor for a brief moment, letting the profound silence wash over me. The deed was signed. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. I walked toward the elevator bank, pressing the down button. The descent from the 40th floor was swift and silent. When the polished metal doors slid open at the lobby level, I walked straight out through the revolving glass doors. The crisp, fresh city air hit my face instantly. The morning mist had cleared, leaving a biting wind that felt incredibly clarifying. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the cold air. I walked down the sidewalk, blending into the crowd of downtown professionals. I was just an anonymous woman in a maternity suit. But inside, I felt like a towering titan. I had dismantled decades of abuse and toxic narcissism with a single digital transaction. Half a block away from the building, I stopped near a bustling coffee shop. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my phone. I stared at the blank screen, waiting. I knew exactly how the banking algorithms functioned. I knew the thresholds, red flags, and security protocols. I had spent the last 4 weeks meticulously structuring this exact moment. I had traced my parents' offshore church funds. I had linked their illicit transfers directly to the joint account I had used for the down payment. I had intentionally poisoned the well. I felt a vibration against my palm. The screen illuminated with an urgent notification from my banking application. I unlocked the device, my eyes tracking the bold red text that spanned across the screen. Transaction suspended for review. Federal anti-money laundering protocol triggered. Account frozen pending investigation. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The sheer beauty of the trap was its absolute automated certainty. By using a flagged account tied to their embezzled funds, I had forced the federal banking system to halt the transfer. The $120,000 would never reach the developer's escrow account. The money was locked in a digital purgatory, completely inaccessible. But the true genius of the plan lay in the collateral damage. Because the wire transfer was officially suspended under federal investigation, the real estate attorney would be legally obligated to notify the bank holding the mortgage. When the bank realized the down payment was frozen due to suspected money laundering, they would immediately flag the entire transaction. They would look closer at Trey. They would look closer at the source of funds. And most importantly, they would trigger the catastrophic default clause on the personal guarantee my father had just signed. Pastor Calvin had legally bound his home and his church pension to a fraudulent transaction. When the deal inevitably collapsed, the bank would seize his assets to cover the immense legal penalties and breach of contract fees. He had signed away his entire life for a down payment that would never arrive. And because the federal authorities were now actively investigating the accounts, his long history of embezzling church donations was about to be dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. He would lose his house. He would lose his pension. He would lose his pristine reputation. He would lose his congregation. He would lose absolutely everything. And Chloe, the golden child who had literally abandoned her children for a luxury penthouse, would be left homeless, broke, and tied to a scammer whose entire fabricated empire was about to disintegrate. I slipped my phone back into my tote bag. The cold wind whipped my hair across my face, but I did not feel the chill. I felt warm. I felt powerful. I felt completely and utterly free. I hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address to my suburban apartment. I had a husband waiting for me. I had a baby on the way. I had a beautiful, authentic life to return to. The empire of Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne was burning to the ground in a high-rise conference room, and they were too busy popping champagne to even smell the smoke. I leaned back against the leather seat of the taxi, watching the city skyline fade into the distance, and I let out a long, satisfied exhale. 3 weeks passed in a deceptive, quiet lull. The federal banking investigation operated strictly in the shadows, building a massive, inescapable net around my parents and their fraudulent assets. Meanwhile, Chloe and Trey were busy living in a complete delusion. The condo developers, eager to close the sale and temporarily satisfied by the initial, albeit frozen, wire transfer confirmation, had foolishly handed over the keys pending final clearance. That was a standard loophole Trey had undoubtedly exploited before. He knew how to manipulate the grace period between a signed contract and a fully cleared federal wire. They had the keys, and they were determined to show off their fake empire before the reality of their situation came crashing down on their heads. Tonight was the night of their grand catered housewarming party. Andre and I had absolutely not been invited. Chloe made sure to broadcast the event across every social media platform, flaunting the imported floral arrangements, the live jazz quartet playing on the balcony, and the exorbitant catering spread. She wanted the entire world to witness her triumph. She wanted to solidify her new status among the church elite and the city's wealthy socialites. Andre parked our reliable sedan down the street from the towering glass high-rise. He turned the engine off and looked at me, a sharp, knowing smile playing on his lips. He wore a crisp, dark suit, and I was dressed in an elegant emerald green maternity gown. We looked completely put together, a united front ready to witness the spectacular implosion of my family's toxic dynasty. I checked the digital clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 7:30 in the evening. We had exactly 30 minutes until the federal grace period officially expired and the bank seized the property. We walked into the extravagant lobby and confidently bypassed the front desk concierge, slipping into the elevator directly behind a group of wealthy church elders. The doors opened on the penthouse floor, revealing a scene of absolute chaotic absurdity. The luxury condo was packed shoulder to shoulder with an incredibly bizarre mix of guests. On one side of the massive living room, the elite, judgmental members of my father's church congregation stood in their conservative Sunday best, sipping sparkling cider and marveling at the panoramic city views. On the other side, Trey's shady, opportunistic friends roamed the pristine hardwood floors. They wore flashy, overly expensive streetwear, holding heavy glasses of dark liquor and speaking loudly over the elegant jazz music. It was a spectacular clash of two entirely fake worlds. Andre and I stepped through the grand double doors. We did not even make it 3 steps into the marble foyer before my mother intercepted us. Sister Yvonne materialized out of the crowd like a heat-seeking missile. She wore a glittering silver evening gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her face, usually plastered with a fake welcoming smile for the church elders, instantly contorted into a mask of pure unadulterated venom the second she saw me. She grabbed my arm, her manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin. She tried to physically pull me back toward the elevator hallway, her eyes darting around frantically to ensure none of the congregants were watching our interaction. "What on earth are you doing here, Naomi?" My mother hissed, her voice a sharp, furious whisper. "I explicitly told you that you were forbidden from coming tonight. You are not on the guest list. You are going to ruin Chloe's perfect night with your bitter, jealous energy. Look at you waddling in here trying to steal her spotlight. Get out right now before your father sees you." I calmly looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I simply reached over and pried her fingers off my skin with an icy, undeniable authority. I would not miss this night for the entire world. "Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly level and entirely unbothered. "I paid the price of admission, remember? I just wanted to see what my money bought." Before she could utter another toxic demand, I stepped smoothly past her, leaving her standing in the foyer with her mouth hanging open. Andre followed right behind me, shooting my mother a look of absolute chilling indifference. I walked straight up to a passing waiter dressed in a crisp tuxedo. He was holding a silver platter of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres. I picked up a delicate smoked salmon blini, popped it into my mouth, and smiled. It tasted exactly like impending justice. I glanced at my phone. 7:45, 15 minutes left. Chloe was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows, completely oblivious to my arrival. She wore a clinging, heavily sequined designer gown that reflected the city lights. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back, and clutching a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She was actively boasting to a group of older churchwomen about how Trey had surprised her with the penthouse. She spun a ridiculous fabricated tale about his massive success in the cryptocurrency market, completely omitting the fact that her father had leveraged his entire church pension to secure the mortgage. Trey was standing nearby, aggressively networking with a wealthy church deacon, trying to pitch some imaginary startup investment fund. They were both drowning in their own magnificent delusion. I wandered away from the main crowd, finding a quiet corner near the massive marble kitchen island. I rested my hand on my pregnant belly, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from my baby. I watched my father schmoozing with the head of the church finance committee. Pastor Calvin was laughing, slapping the man on the back, soaking in the absolute admiration of his peers. He looked so incredibly proud, so deeply convinced of his own invincibility. "Naomi, what a surprise to see you here tonight." I turned to see Elder Thomas approaching me. He was a notoriously nosy, highly influential member of my father's church board. Elder Thomas was a retired accountant who held a significant amount of sway over the church's financial decisions. He was exactly the person I needed to speak with. "Hello, Elder Thomas," I said, offering him a warm, polite smile. "It is a beautiful condo, isn't it?" "It certainly is," he replied, his eyes sweeping over the lavish decorations. "Your father was just telling us how brilliantly Trey managed this acquisition. It is truly a blessing to see young people thriving so wonderfully. Though I must admit, I was quite surprised when your father mentioned he was assisting with the administrative side of the purchase. Pastor Calvin usually leaves secular real estate matters to the professionals." I took a slow, deliberate sip from my glass of sparkling water. I looked at Elder Thomas, letting a small, concerning frown cross my features. I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice to a confidential, hushed tone. "Well, between you and me, Elder Thomas, I would not call it merely administrative assistance," I murmured, ensuring my words carried the exact right amount of hesitant concern. "My father has been incredibly generous lately. In fact, his personal finances have become very creative over the past few weeks. I just pray he has not overextended himself. You know how blindly devoted he is to keeping Chloe happy." Elder Thomas frowned, his sharp accountant instincts instantly triggered by my choice of words. "Creative." He repeated, his tone dropping to match mine. "What exactly do you mean by creative, Naomi? The church board relies on complete transparency from the pastor." I let out a soft, reluctant sigh, acting as though I were burdened by a heavy family secret. I looked away, gazing directly at my father across the room. "I really should not say too much," I whispered hesitantly. "I just know that securing a mortgage of this magnitude, especially with Trey's complicated financial history, requires a massive amount of liquid collateral. I am just a data analyst, but the numbers I have seen do not exactly add up to a standard co-signing agreement. I would just hate to see the church's reputation or its pension funds tied up in a high-risk, unsecured luxury real estate gamble. But I am sure my father knows exactly what he is doing." I patted Elder Thomas gently on the arm and offered a tight, worried smile. I stepped away, leaving the older man staring at my father with a look of profound, growing suspicion. The seed was planted. The church board was officially alerted. When the federal investigation inevitably cracked my father's accounts wide open, Elder Thomas would be the very first person demanding a full, merciless forensic audit of the church treasury. I navigated through the dense crowd and found Andre standing near the balcony doors. He was watching Trey attempt to impress a group of young women with his fake gold watch. Andre wrapped a protective, loving arm around my waist, pulling me close. "How are we doing?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the chaotic room. "We are right on schedule," I replied, checking my phone screen one more time. It was 7:58. The live jazz band transitioned into an upbeat, lively tempo. Waiters circulated with fresh trays of expensive champagne. My mother was busy glaring at me from across the room, furiously texting someone on her phone, completely unaware that her entire reality was about to violently collapse. Chloe clinked her glass against trays, shouting over the music to propose a toast to their beautiful, limitless future. The arrogance in her voice was absolutely suffocating. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed she had successfully discarded her children, exploited my savings, manipulated our parents, and secured a lifetime of unearned luxury. The digital clock on my phone screen clicked forward, 7:59. I thought back to the countless times my family had made me feel utterly small. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of wearing Chloe's faded, discarded clothes while she paraded around in brand new dresses. I remembered my parents looking at my college acceptance letters with pure disdain, refusing to co-sign a simple $5,000 student loan because I was not worth the financial risk. I remembered my mother calling my data analytics career boring computer work, constantly belittling my intelligence and my independence. I remembered the endless, exhausting demands for emergency cash, the guilt trips, the manipulation, and the absolute refusal to ever treat me like a valued equal member of their family. They had pushed me into a corner, assuming I would simply fold and surrender my future to fund their toxic delusions. They underestimated me entirely. They thought they were dealing with the same compliant, desperate girl who just wanted her parents' love. They did not realize they were dealing with a woman who had meticulously mapped out their financial destruction using their own blinding greed as the ultimate weapon. The digital clock rolled over, 8 o'clock. Instantly, the heavy, imposing double doors of the penthouse burst open with a loud, violent crash that completely drowned out the jazz music. The lively chatter in the room died in a matter of seconds. Every single head turned toward the foyer. 4 uniformed city police officers strode into the apartment. They were accompanied by 2 serious, stern-looking men wearing dark federal windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI across the back. Right behind them stood Mr. Sterling, the real estate attorney, looking absolutely furious and gripping a thick stack of legal documents. The music abruptly stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the lavish housewarming party. The elite church members stared in absolute shock. Trey's shady friends immediately began edging toward the back balcony, trying to distance themselves from the sudden law enforcement presence. My mother dropped her crystal champagne glass. It shattered against the imported Italian marble floor, the sharp cracking sound echoing loudly in the dead silent room. Chloe froze, her arrogant smile sliding completely off her face. My father took a step forward, his chest puffed out, attempting to summon his booming, authoritative, pastoral voice to regain control of the room. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Pastor Calvin demanded, glaring at the federal agents. "This is a private residence. You are trespassing on my daughter's property." The lead FBI agent did not flinch. He pulled a folded warrant from his jacket pocket and looked directly at my father. "Actually, sir, this property belongs to the bank," the agent stated, his voice ringing out clearly for the entire church congregation to hear. The wire transfer for the down payment was federally flagged and suspended for suspected money laundering. The mortgage guarantee has been completely nullified due to fraudulent collateral. We are here to seize the premises immediately, and we have a federal warrant for the arrest of Calvin Harris on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. I leaned back against Andre, letting out a soft, satisfied breath. The absolute sheer magnitude of the federal agent's incredibly staggering final declaration hung heavily in the stagnant air of the luxurious penthouse. The silence that followed was so profound and absolute that I could hear the faint, frantic ticking of the fake gold watch on Trey's wrist. The jazz quartet, who had stopped playing mid-note, slowly lowered their instruments and backed away toward the expensive imported kitchen cabinets. The glittering illusion my parents had so desperately sacrificed my entire life to build was currently shattering into a million irreparable pieces across the Italian marble floor. Chloe stared at the lead agent with wide, vacant eyes, her champagne-soaked brain completely unable to process the legal reality crashing down upon her. She looked like a malfunctioning mannequin. "This is a mistake!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into an unhinged, desperate pitch. "You cannot be here. You cannot do this. We just bought this condo. We have the keys. The transaction is fully complete." My sister lunged forward, waving the shiny brass keys directly in the agent's stoic face. He did not blink. He calmly reached into his dark jacket and produced a thick, legally binding document bearing the heavy seal of the federal government. He held it out to her, but she refused to take it, crossing her arms tightly over her sequined gown. The agent simply let the document flutter down onto the expensive glass coffee table. "That is a formal eviction and immediate asset seizure notice." The agent stated, his voice carrying an icy, unyielding authority. "The property developers have officially rescinded the sale due to fraudulent financial backing and suspected money laundering. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you refuse to comply, you will be physically removed and charged with criminal trespassing." The words struck Chloe like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Sister Yvonne let out a horrifying, guttural wail. She rushed to Chloe's side, wrapping her arms around her golden child, as if she could physically shield her from the federal government. My mother glared at the agents, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "Do you know who we are?" my mother screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the officers. "My husband is the senior pastor of the largest congregation in this city. He is a deeply respected man of God. You are ruining my daughter's housewarming party over a banking glitch. This is harassment. We will sue you. We will sue the bank." The lead agent ignored my mother's hysterical threats entirely. He signaled to the two local police officers standing by the heavy wooden doors. The officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The sudden movement sent a violent wave of panic rippling through the crowd of upscale party guests. The wealthy church elders who had been sipping expensive wine just moments before now began frantically murmuring among themselves. They were actively stepping away from my parents, treating them like a highly contagious disease. I watched Elder Thomas pull out his mobile phone, his face pale with righteous fury. He was already drafting an emergency email to the entire church finance committee, demanding an immediate lock on all congregational bank accounts. Amidst the escalating chaos, Trey recognized the inevitable end of his lucrative scam. While my parents and Chloe were busy screaming at the federal agents, Trey slowly and deliberately backed away from the center of the room. He abandoned his half-empty glass of expensive liquor on a nearby bookshelf. He kept his head down, trying to blend in with the panicked crowd of church members. I watched his eyes dart toward the sprawling glass balcony doors. He was calculating the distance to the external fire escape stairwell. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had fled from countless unpaid bills and fraudulent leases before. But Trey had severely underestimated the tactical awareness of the federal investigators. As he reached out to slide the heavy glass door open, a massive, broad-shouldered police officer stepped directly into his path, completely blocking the exit. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone low and menacing. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Trey offered a slick, arrogant smile, adjusting his cheap suit jacket. "I am just stepping out for some fresh air, officer." Trey lied effortlessly. "It is getting a bit too crowded in here for my taste. I have nothing to do with these people or their financial problems. I am just a guest." The officer did not smile back. He reached into his back pocket and retrieved a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Actually, Marcus Trayvon Jenkins, you are not going anywhere," the officer stated, reading Trey's real legal name aloud for everyone to hear. "We have 3 active warrants for your arrest across 2 different state lines regarding wire fraud and grand larceny. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Trey's arrogant facade collapsed instantly. He tried to shove past the officer, but 2 more agents swarmed him, slamming him face first against the reinforced glass window. The harsh click of the handcuffs echoing over the murmuring crowd was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Chloe watched her supposed billionaire boyfriend get dragged away in metal restraints, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She finally realized that the magnificent empire she thought she ruled was nothing but a cheap, devastating illusion. My father, completely unhinged by the sight of Trey in handcuffs, charged toward the lead FBI agent. His face was purple with pure, unchecked rage. He completely abandoned his calm, pastoral demeanor, reverting to a desperate, cornered man, fighting for his absolute survival. "This is an absolute outrage," Pastor Calvin roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You have absolutely no right to seize this property or investigate my accounts. There is no money laundering. There is no embezzlement. The money for this luxury condo came entirely from my eldest daughter's personal savings. She wired the funds directly from her own bank account this morning. She is the one you should be investigating. She is the criminal." He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly across the room. He pointed right at me. Every single person in the penthouse turned to follow his gaze. They looked at me standing quietly in the corner in my simple green maternity dress, supported by my loving husband. I did not flinch under the weight of their collective stares. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my furious father. The lead agent looked at me, then looked back at my father with an expression of profound professional pity. "Sir," the agent said, his voice cutting through my father's hysterical shouting, "we are fully aware of the wire transfer your daughter initiated. In fact, her completely legitimate transaction is exactly what triggered our automated federal anti-money laundering protocols. You see, the joint account she used to transfer the funds was linked to a series of highly suspicious offshore routing numbers that our forensic accountants have explicitly tied to the charitable donation funds of your church. When the massive sum of $120,000 attempted to process through that heavily monitored network, it flagged the entire system. Your daughter did not commit a crime. She simply tried to make a standard real estate deposit using an account that you had thoroughly compromised with your own illegal embezzlement." My father staggered backward as if he had been shot in the chest. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He finally understood the absolute, undeniable perfection of the trap. I had not given them my money. I had used my money as the irresistible bait to drag their hidden financial crimes directly into the federal spotlight. My mother let out another piercing scream, collapsing onto the expensive marble floor, as the local police officers moved in to officially detain my father. Pastor Calvin, the untouchable, arrogant leader of the community, was shoved roughly against the kitchen island, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The grand golden illusion was completely dead. Chloe dropped to her knees beside my mother, weeping uncontrollably as the agents ordered everyone to evacuate the premises immediately. Andre took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against my skin. We turned our backs on the wreckage of my toxic family, walking calmly toward the elevator. We stepped inside the metal car, watching the doors slowly slide shut on their tragic self-inflicted downfall forever. I rested my free hand over my pregnant belly, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound protective tranquility wash over me. Our child would never know them. We were finally free to build our own beautiful, authentic future without looking over our shoulders. The night air felt magnificent. We stepped onto the street and walked away. The night air felt magnificent. We stepped onto the street and walked away. However, before we could even reach our parked car, a sudden commotion erupted from the grand entrance of the luxury building. The federal agents were already marching my family down to the lobby. The operation was moving with lightning speed. The authorities had corralled my parents, Chloe and Trey, into the massive, brightly lit community room adjacent to the main concierge desk. The remaining church elders were held off to the side, watching the spectacle with wide, horrified eyes. I stopped walking. Andre looked down at me, understanding exactly what I needed to do. We turned around and walked right back through the revolving glass doors. I needed to finish this. I needed them to hear the absolute truth directly from my mouth. As I entered the expansive community room, my father was currently screaming at the lead investigator. Pastor Calvin was straining against the firm grip of a local police officer, his face a violent shade of purple. He demanded to know what was going on, spittle flying from his lips as he frantically defended his golden child. He pointed his bound hands toward the ceiling, screeching that there was a massive mistake. He yelled that the $120,000 deposit came strictly from his daughter's personal savings. He claimed I was a bitter, jealous sibling who was simply trying to frame them. Sister Yvonne stood beside him, weeping hysterically and smoothing Chloe's ruined designer dress. Chloe looked completely vacant, staring at the asset seizure notice in her trembling hands. The entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence when I stepped forward into the center of the room. Every eye locked onto me. My father glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I did not flinch. I stood tall, feeling the empowering weight of my own brilliant execution. I looked directly into my father's furious eyes and offered a calm, entirely steady smile. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Father," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the vast, marble-floored room. "The money for this luxury penthouse was indeed wired from that joint account. But you are completely wrong about whose money it actually was." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I calmly explained to my horrified family that the $120,000 I wired was not my savings. It was never my savings. The blood instantly drained from my father's face. His aggressive shouting demeanor evaporated, replaced by a sudden creeping terror. Sister Yvonne stopped crying, her jaw dropping open in sheer confusion. Chloe finally looked up from the eviction paper, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend my words. "What are you talking about?" my mother hissed, her voice shaking with panic. "We saw the bank statement. We saw your money in that account. You wired your savings to the escrow." I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice settling into my bones. I am a senior data analyst for a major financial technology firm, I explained, pacing slowly in the center of the room. My entire career is built on tracking digital footprints, analyzing complex financial data, and identifying hidden monetary anomalies. Did you really think I would just blindly dump my hard-earned life savings into a joint account without monitoring every single transaction? A month before this ridiculous housewarming dinner, I noticed some glaring discrepancies in the joint account. I noticed a series of bizarre, highly structured deposits arriving from obscure offshore routing numbers. They were completely uncharacteristic for a standard joint savings account. So I did what I do best. I traced the routing numbers. I dug deep into the digital architecture of those specific transfers. And what I found was absolutely breathtaking. I turned my attention to the church elders who were leaning in, hanging on to my every word. Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne had been meticulously funneling embezzled church charity funds into that exact account to hide the money. My parents gasped in unison. My father stumbled backward, knocking into the police officer holding him. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. The church elders erupted into furious murmurs, their faces twisting with righteous anger and utter betrayal. Elder Thomas stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, demanding to know the full extent of the financial corruption. I kept my eyes locked onto my parents, refusing to grant them a single ounce of mercy. "You used my name as a shield," I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You assumed that because I was your quiet, compliant, invisible daughter, I would never question the sudden influx of cash. You thought you could mask your stolen church donations by mixing them with my legitimate income. You wanted to use my pristine credit and my clean banking history to wash your dirty money. You were using the joint account as a personal, unregulated laundering machine. And the best part is you actually thought you were smarter than a senior data analyst. You thought your sloppy, archaic routing methods would go completely unnoticed." Sister Yvonne began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as the severe, inescapable reality of her federal crimes crashed down upon her. She looked wildly at the FBI agents, begging them to believe it was all a massive misunderstanding. But the agents remained entirely stoic, holding thick folders filled with the exact digital evidence I had anonymously forwarded to their cybercrimes division weeks ago. Chloe stood paralyzed, her designer heels glued to the floor. She finally realized that the magnificent empire she thought she ruled was entirely funded by stolen charity money. Trey, who was already handcuffed near the lobby doors, let out a low, impressed whistle. clearly recognizing a superior con when he saw one. I took another step closer to my father, lowering my voice to a sharp, penetrating register. You demanded that I wire the $120,000 for Chloe's down payment, I stated, staring directly into his terrified soul. You bullied me, you threatened me, and you tried to leverage my unborn child to force my hand. You thought you were stealing my future to fund her unearned luxury. But I had already executed the ultimate checkmate. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute triumph. I had quietly, legally extracted all of my clean money weeks ago. I transferred every single cent of my personal savings into a secure, encrypted account under Andre's name. The $120,000 I wired for the condo was exclusively the dirty church money you had been hiding. I did not give Chloe my life savings. I simply handed her the stolen charity funds you embezzled from your own devoted congregation. The entire room erupted. Elder Thomas shouted in pure outrage, denouncing my father as a thief and a charlatan. The church members began demanding their donations back, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus of betrayal and anger. My mother collapsed against a lobby pillar, sobbing uncontrollably as her pristine social status evaporated into thin air. Pastor Calvin stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly destroyed by the flawless, inescapable logic of my financial trap. He knew he had been beaten. He knew he had handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear his fraudulent kingdom down. Moving that specific sum of illicit money into high-end luxury real estate triggered an automatic federal audit, I explained, delivering the final devastating blow. The banking algorithms are designed to catch sudden massive transfers of flagged funds. When I authorized that wire, I did not just buy Chloe a condo. I turned your sloppy embezzlement scheme into a massive, highly visible federal crime. You handed the authorities a perfect, neatly wrapped paper trail leading directly back to your offshore accounts. You ruined yourselves. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my father's shoulder. He nodded respectfully in my direction before turning his attention back to the disgraced pastor. Your daughter is entirely correct, Mr. Harris, the agent stated, officially stripping my father of his pastoral title. The financial logs provided a direct, undeniable link between the stolen church charity funds and the escrow account used for this property. The asset seizure is fully authorized, and you are facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. My father slumped forward, the remaining fight completely draining from his body. He looked old, frail, and entirely defeated. He had spent his entire life obsessing over his public image, stepping on anyone who got in his way, including his own daughter. Now he was leaving in handcuffs, destined for a concrete cell, while his congregation watched in absolute disgust. Sister Yvonne tried to reach for him, but a female officer gently guided her back, reading her the Miranda rights. She was going down with him, fully complicit in the theft and the cover-up. Chloe stood alone in the center of the lobby, completely abandoned. She looked at the eviction notice in her hands, then looked at me. Her eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate realization. She had lost her children, her luxury penthouse, her wealthy image, and her criminal boyfriend in a single spectacular evening. She had absolutely nothing left. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for mercy or demand a bailout, but the words died in her throat. She finally understood that I owed her nothing. I turned my back on the chaotic, miserable scene. I walked back toward the revolving glass doors, linking my arm through Andre's. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for my entire life was permanently gone. I had not just survived my toxic family. I had surgically dismantled their entire fraudulent existence using my own intelligence and their insatiable greed. We stepped out into the crisp, cool night air, leaving the flashing police lights behind us. The city felt incredibly peaceful, quiet, and completely full of limitless possibilities. I leaned my head against my husband's shoulder, feeling the gentle, reassuring kick of our baby. We walked toward our car, ready to return to our modest, honest, and profoundly happy life. We had protected our future, secured our savings, and delivered the ultimate justice to those who believed they were untouchable. The $60,000 in our secure account would provide a beautiful foundation for our growing family, completely untainted by the toxic legacy of my parents. As we drove away from the towering high rise, I looked at the city skyline feeling a deep, abiding sense of closure. The long, exhausting war was officially over. The truth had been revealed, the guilty were facing their consequences, and the innocent were finally free to thrive. I was no longer the invisible, compliant middle child. I was Kendra, the brilliant data analyst. I was the woman who turned the tables, exposed the corruption, and reclaimed her own destiny. The days following the federal raid were an absolute whirlwind of media coverage and legal proceedings. The local news stations relentlessly broadcasted the spectacular downfall of Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne. Their faces were splashed across every television screen, accompanied by staggering details of their long-running charity embezzlement scheme. The community was horrified, but they were also incredibly grateful that the corruption had finally been exposed. The church board, led by a highly motivated Elder Thomas, initiated a massive internal audit, working closely with federal investigators to recover the stolen funds. They publicly denounced my parents, completely severing all ties and stripping them of their positions. Chloe, entirely stripped of her financial safety net, was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. She attempted to secure a job at a local retail store, but her lack of real-world experience and terrible attitude resulted in her being fired within the first week. Trey remained incarcerated, his extensive criminal history guaranteeing a very long sentence. Jamal, completely free from Chloe's toxic influence, flourished as a single father, providing a safe, loving home for their two children. He frequently sent me pictures of the kids smiling and playing in the park, a beautiful testament to the positive ripple effects of my actions. Andre and I welcomed a beautiful, healthy baby girl 3 months later. We named her Maya. She brought an immeasurable amount of joy and light into our home. We used our safely secured savings to purchase a modest, charming house with a large backyard and a sturdy oak tree, a perfect place for Maya to grow and play. My career continued to soar, my expertise in uncovering financial fraud earning me a major promotion and a substantial raise. I used my skills to protect others, ensuring that corrupt individuals could not hide behind digital curtains. We completely severed all contact with my parents and Chloe. They attempted to reach out from prison, sending manipulative letters begging for forgiveness and financial assistance, but I returned them completely unopened. I had absolutely no space in my life for their toxicity. I had built a beautiful, authentic existence entirely on my own terms, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected me. The $120,000 truth had shattered their fake empire, but it had built mine. We spent our weekends hosting barbecues with genuine friends, taking long walks in the park, and reading bedtime stories to Maya. I looked around our cozy living room, watching Andre make silly faces to hear our daughter laugh, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The heavy, dark shadow of my past was gone forever, replaced by the bright, unyielding light of my own making. I was a survivor, a protector, and a mother. The execution was not just flawless, it was entirely unapologetically liberating. The execution was absolutely flawless. The crushing weight of the federal agent declaration hung in the stagnant air of the luxurious penthouse, paralyzing everyone in the room. The smooth jazz music was completely dead, replaced by the chaotic, panicked murmurs of the elite church congregation. They were watching their untouchable spiritual leader, Pastor Calvin, get completely dismantled in real time. The heavy realization of federal money laundering charges echoed off the marble floors. Everyone was processing the absolute devastation, but nobody processed it faster or more selfishly than Trey himself did today. Trey had spent his entire life operating as a professional parasite, skimming off the wealth and desperation of others. He knew exactly what a federal asset seizure meant. He knew that the federal investigators did not raid a luxury high-rise without ironclad, undeniable evidence. He also knew that his name was deeply entangled with Chloe on the fraudulent lease agreements, but he had purposely avoided signing the primary banking documents. The second he heard the words money laundering and federal warrant, his survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He looked at Chloe, the woman he manipulated and completely used daily. He did not see a partner. He saw a massive glowing red target. He saw federal prison time. Chloe was still standing in the center of the foyer, shaking violently. She looked at Trey, her eyes wide with absolute childish terror. She reached out her hands, expecting her self-proclaimed billionaire boyfriend to protect her, to scream at the agents to fix the catastrophic mess. Trey, tell them this is a mistake, Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Tell them you have the funds. Tell them to leave our home alone. Do something right now. Trey did not offer a single word of comfort. His eyes darted toward the hallway, calculating the exact distance to the emergency stairwell. He knew the local police officers were currently distracted by my very hysterical, booming father. He had a narrow, fleeting window of opportunity. He moved with the desperate, frantic speed of a cornered animal. Chloe tried to grab his arm, her manicured acrylic nails digging into the fabric of his cheap, flashy suit jacket. Trey did not hesitate. He violently shoved her aside. The immense physical force of the blow caught Chloe completely off guard right then. She stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the polished marble. She let out a sharp cry as she crashed heavily onto the hard floor, the heavy sequins of her dress scraping harshly against the stone. Trey did not even look back to see if she was hurt. He ripped the heavy, expensive-looking fake gold watch off his own wrist, tossing the counterfeit jewelry onto a nearby glass table to shed any identifiable weight. He sprinted toward the master bedroom. The federal agents shouted loud commands, their voices booming across the chaotic room, but Trey was already moving fast. He threw open the heavy oak door of the master suite and began furiously rummaging through the bedside tables. He bypassed the velvet jewelry boxes and went straight for the hidden compartment where he kept a stack of emergency cash. He grabbed thick handfuls of $100 bills, stuffing them aggressively into his jacket pockets. He abandoned his expensive designer luggage, his custom-tailored suits, and the entire fraudulent life he had built with my sister. He only cared about hard currency and immediate escape. He dashed out of the bedroom, his eyes wild, totally desperate for his ultimate freedom. A local police officer tried to intercept him near the kitchen island, but Trey lunged to the side, knocking over a towering tray of completely catered fancy appetizers. Smoked salmon and expensive caviar rained down onto the immaculate floor. Trey bolted through the heavy double doors of the penthouse, sprinting down the carpeted corridor toward the emergency exit stairs. He was abandoning Chloe instantly, leaving her to take the absolute full force of the federal money laundering charges. He was a rat fleeing a spectacularly sinking ship, taking whatever loose cash he could possibly carry away with him right now. Back inside the penthouse, the situation had descended into pure, unadulterated madness. Chloe remained on the floor, her legs tangled in her glamorous evening gown. She stared at the empty doorway where Trey had just vanished, her mind completely unable to process the profound, humiliating abandonment. She had sacrificed her own children for this man. She had signed away her legal custody, completely destroying her family, just to secure a spot by his side in this luxury condo. And at the very first sign of trouble, he had physically assaulted her and run away into the dark night so quickly. The illusion of her grand, wealthy lifestyle evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the cold, harsh reality of federal criminal charges. She curled her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably, her loud, agonizing wails echoing over the shocked gasps of the church congregation. My father was faring no better. Pastor Calvin was currently pinned against the marble kitchen island by two federal agents. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled, and his pastoral authority was completely stripped away. He was sweating profusely, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He demanded answers, screaming that he was an absolute victim here right now. "This is an illegal seizure," Pastor Calvin roared, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "You cannot take this property. You cannot touch my pension. I am a highly respected man of God. The down payment was completely clean. It came from my daughter. You need to verify the wire transfer. You are making a catastrophic mistake." A severe, sharply dressed investigator from the bank fraud division stepped forward. He held a thick clipboard filled with heavily redacted financial logs. He looked down at my father with an expression of pure clinical disgust. There is absolutely no mistake made here. There is no mistake here, Calvin, the investigator stated, his voice slicing through my father and his hysterical shouting. We have been actively monitoring your offshore church accounts for the past 6 months. We watched you systematically funnel thousands of dollars in illicit untaxed charity donations into a domestic joint account. We watched you attempt to wash those stolen funds by authorizing a wire transfer for a luxury real estate deposit. My father shook his head frantically, refusing to accept the reality of his own demise. I only co-signed the massive mortgage, he pleaded, desperately trying to survive today. I just provided the collateral, he begged, his arrogance finally giving way to genuine suffocating panic. I did not authorize the transfer. You cannot hold me responsible for the entire loan. The investigator flipped a page on his clipboard, his expression completely devoid of mercy. You signed a legally binding personal guarantee, Calvin. You leveraged your fully paid-off suburban residence and your entire highly funded church retirement pension as absolute collateral for a high-risk $600,000 mortgage. Because the initial down payment was flagged as dirty money, the bank declared the contract in default completely today. Your signature makes you entirely liable for the fraudulent loan penalties, the breach of contract fees, and the immediate repayment of the developer's lost equity. The investigator paused, letting the devastating words hang in the air. The bank is formally initiating foreclosure proceedings on your personal residence effective immediately. Furthermore, your church pension accounts are currently frozen and will be seized by federal authorities to cover the remaining balance of the penalties. You have lost your home. You have lost your retirement. You are completely financially ruined. My mother. Sister Yvonne let out a piercing, horrifying, agonizing, extremely loud scream. She dropped to her knees beside the shattered remains of her champagne glass, burying her face in her hands. Her entire life was built on maintaining an illusion of wealth, superiority, and divine favor. She had spent decades parading around the church, judging everyone else, completely convinced of her own untouchable status. Now she was going to be homeless, disgraced, and married to a convicted federal felon. The elite church members were backing away, abandoning their fallen leaders. I stood in the center of the room, watching the magnificent, chaotic destruction unfold completely unhindered before my very own cold eyes. I walked slowly across the room, the soft fabric of my emerald green maternity gown brushing against the cold marble floor. I stopped directly in front of Chloe. She was still crumpled on the ground. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate realization. I looked down at Chloe. You wanted my money to play a rich wife. Now you have no man, no kids, no condo, and federal debt. Consider your black tax paid in full. I turned and walked away, leaving my toxic family behind forever. The heavy glass doors of the luxury building closed behind us, sealing away the screaming, the panic, and the complete destruction of my parents' empire. The cool night air hit my face, washing away the stench of their lies. Andre squeezed my hand, a silent promise that we were finally free. We walked to our car in perfect silence, letting the magnitude of the evening settle over us. I slept that night without tossing, without turning, and without the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The following days were an absolute storm of media coverage. The local news channels played a continuous loop of my father being escorted from the penthouse in handcuffs. The church community was entirely paralyzed by the scandal. Their beloved, untouchable spiritual leader had been exposed as a common criminal. 4 days after the raid, my phone rang. It was Elder Thomas, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. He requested my presence at an emergency church board meeting. He needed a key witness to finalize the internal investigation. I agreed immediately. I wore a simple black dress, arriving at the massive sanctuary with Andre by my side. The parking lot was overflowing with cars. Every single member of the congregation had shown up, packing the wooden pews to their absolute limit. The atmosphere inside the sanctuary was suffocating. There were no joyful hymns, no usher greetings, and no smiling faces. There was only a heavy, oppressive silence. I took my seat in the front row, crossing my arms and waiting for the final reckoning. Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne were escorted into the sanctuary by two security guards. They had posted bail, but the immense financial toll was already visible on their faces. My father wore a wrinkled gray suit, his shoulders slumped, his signature arrogant swagger entirely gone. My mother trailed behind him, her hair flat, her expensive jewelry missing, her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. They were directed to stand behind a small wooden table directly facing the congregation they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and manipulate. Elder Thomas stepped up to the main pulpit. He gripped the edges of the podium, glaring down at my parents with absolute disgust. Calvin Harris, Elder. Thomas began, his voice echoing loudly through the sound system. You have betrayed the sacred trust of this community. You have stolen from the poor, the sick, and the needy to fund your own selfish vanity. We have reviewed the bank statements, the transfer logs, and the federal seizure notices. The evidence is undeniable. You are a thief. My father bowed his head, unable to meet the angry stares of the people who had blindly followed him for decades. The board of directors has voted unanimously. Elder Thomas declared, his tone cold and unforgiving. We are officially stripping you of your pastoral title. You are no longer welcome in this church. Furthermore, we are demanding full financial restitution. We will pursue every legal avenue to seize whatever assets you have left, to repay the charity funds you so brazenly stole. The congregation erupted into loud murmurs of approval. The angry whispers filled the large room, a harsh chorus of judgment raining down on the disgraced couple. Sister Yvonne could not handle the crushing weight of public rejection. She grabbed the microphone from the wooden table, her hands trembling violently. She looked out at the angry crowd and immediately shifted into her familiar victim persona. She let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face in her free hand for dramatic effect. Please, my mother cried, her voice cracking with fake emotion. You must listen to me. We are innocent victims in all of this. The devil has launched a massive attack against our family. He is trying to destroy this ministry by spreading vicious lies and deceit. We were tricked by corrupt developers. We did not know the funds were tainted. She pointed a trembling finger toward the ceiling. We are being tested by dark forces, she wailed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. You know my husband. You know his heart. He would never steal from the church. We are faithful servants of the Lord, and we are being persecuted for our righteousness. A few older members of the congregation looked momentarily conflicted, their ingrained loyalty warring with the glaring evidence of theft. My mother saw their hesitation and leaned into her performance, sobbing louder and clutching her chest. She was trying to manipulate their faith, weaponizing their religion to save her own skin. Elder Thomas looked utterly repulsed by her theatrical display. He reached out to turn off her microphone, but I stood up from my seat in the front row. I walked calmly toward the front of the sanctuary, my footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I looked at Elder Thomas and extended my hand. Elder Thomas nodded slowly and handed me the microphone. The sanctuary fell completely silent. Every eye was locked onto me. I turned to face the massive crowd. I did not yell, I did not cry. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the absolute, undeniable truth with cold, calculated precision. My parents are not victims of a spiritual attack, I stated calmly, my voice projecting clearly to the back rows of the church. They are victims of their own insatiable greed. The devil did not force them to steal your charity donations. Their obsession with social status did. They actively chose to embezzle your money. I looked directly at my mother, who was glaring at me with pure venom. They sacrificed their integrity, their morality, and their family simply to fund Chloe's delusions of grandeur. I continued. They wanted the world to believe they were incredibly wealthy. They wanted to brag about a luxury penthouse. They wanted to prove they were superior. I turned my attention back to the congregation. They stole the money you donated for the community food bank. They took the funds you gave for the youth outreach programs. They funneled every single dollar into an offshore account, attempting to wash the money through my personal banking information. They tried to frame me for their crimes. My father stepped forward, his face red with panic. "She is lying!" Pastor Calvin shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "She is a bitter, jealous child who is trying to ruin our reputation. Do not listen to her." But the congregation was not buying his lies anymore. The illusion was completely shattered. I ignored his desperate outburst and kept my focus on the crowd. "They did not care about this church," I stated firmly. "They only cared about appearances. They bought Chloe's loyalty with your stolen money. They funded her fake billionaire lifestyle, while ordinary people in this very room struggled to pay their basic bills and feed their families." The truth hit the congregation like a physical blow. The absolute reality of their pastor's betrayal sank in, replacing their initial shock with a deep, furious resolve. A woman in the third row, who had faithfully volunteered at the church pantry for 15 years, stood up. She looked at my parents, her expression filled with profound disgust. She did not say a single word. She simply turned her back on them. The man sitting next to her stood up and did the exact same thing. Slowly, deliberately, person after person rose from their wooden pews. They did not shout. They did not throw insults. They simply stood up and turned their backs. Within 2 minutes, the entire sanctuary was standing facing the back doors of the church. The absolute silence was deafening. It was the ultimate, unmistakable symbol of total rejection. Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne were completely isolated, staring at a sea of turned backs. Their loyal followers had officially abandoned them. My mother let out a pathetic whimpering sound, collapsing against the wooden table. Her fake tears had failed. Her religious manipulation had completely backfired. My father stared at the backs of his former congregation, his shoulders trembling. He had spent decades demanding their absolute respect and blind obedience. Now he was completely invisible to them. I handed the microphone back to Elder Thomas. He nodded at me, a silent expression of deep gratitude. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, passing row after row of people who had finally recognized the painful truth. Andre met me at the heavy wooden doors. He wrapped his arms securely around my waist, guiding me out of the suffocating sanctuary and into the bright, welcoming afternoon sunlight. The dark chapter of my life was finally and permanently closed. My toxic parents had lost their home, their wealth, their freedom, and their entire community. They had willfully traded their souls for a cheap illusion of grandeur. I stepped into our waiting car, perfectly ready to embrace my own beautiful, authentic future. We slowly drove away, leaving the tragic wreckage completely behind us forever. Exactly 3 long, incredibly stressful weeks. After that definitive, triumphant departure, the absolute finality of my decision was severely tested one last time. A massive, relentless, incredibly loud thunderstorm had rolled violently into the city, blanketing the empty streets in heavy, punishing sheets of freezing rain and violently shaking the large, reinforced windows of our extremely secure, luxury high-rise apartment building. Andre and I were safely inside, completely insulated from the bitter, biting cold and the torrential, blinding downpour raging outside. I was comfortably resting on our plush, expensive living room sofa, a warm, soft blanket draped protectively over my heavily pregnant belly, quietly reading an engaging book while the storm raged loudly against the thick, reinforced glass. It was now nearly midnight. The dark world outside was deeply chaotic, menacing, and entirely unforgiving. The sudden, incredibly sharp buzz of our apartment intercom completely shattered the peaceful, quiet tranquility of our safe evening. Andre paused his late television show, his dark brow furrowing in deep confusion. He walked quickly over to the security panel mounted securely on the wall and pressed the brightly flashing button. The tense voice of Marcus, our highly trusted night shift security guard, crackled loudly through the small electronic speaker. He sounded uncharacteristically tense and worried. "Mr. and Mrs. Davis," Marcus said gently, his deep voice laced with heavy, undeniable hesitation. "I am incredibly sorry to disturb you both so very late at night. There are 2 older individuals standing down here in the main front lobby. They are completely soaked from the pouring rain, and they are actively causing a major, loud disturbance at the exterior glass security doors. They aggressively claim to be Kendra's parents. They are demanding immediate entry to your private building and stubbornly refusing to leave the premises. A cold, sharp, horrifying shiver rapidly ran down my spine. My desperate parents had somehow managed to track down our highly secure unlisted address. Andre immediately gripped the plastic intercom button, his voice incredibly firm and fiercely protective. Do not let them inside, Marcus. Andre instructed very clearly. Threaten to call the local police if they do not vacate the property right now. I will be right down to handle this. I stood up from the sofa, gently placing my book onto the coffee table. I am coming with you, I said, my voice completely steady. Andre looked at me, genuine concern flashing in his dark eyes. He wanted to shield me from their toxicity, especially in my current condition, but he also knew my resolute stubbornness. This was my battle to finish. I needed to look them in the eyes one final time. I slipped on my warm slippers and pulled a thick cardigan over my green maternity shirt. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor in complete silence, the low hum of the machinery providing a strange rhythmic backdrop to my racing thoughts. When the silver elevator doors finally slid open, the chaotic scene in the grand lobby was absolutely pathetic. The building featured a massive floor-to-ceiling wall of thick bulletproof security glass that completely separated the luxurious interior waiting area from the harsh external elements. Standing out there in the freezing, relentless downpour were Pastor Calvin and Sister Yvonne. They looked nothing like the arrogant, untouchable religious royalty they had spent decades pretending to be. The heavy rain had entirely ruined my mother's meticulously styled hair, leaving it plastered in wet, stringy clumps against her pale cheeks. Her expensive designer coat was completely soaked, clinging to her shivering frame. My father looked even worse. His posture was completely hunched, his cheapened suit dripping water onto the pristine concrete pavement. They were frantically banging their bare fists against the thick security glass, leaving frantic, greasy handprints all over the immaculate surface. Marcus, the security guard, stood safely on the inside, his hand resting cautiously on his radio, fully prepared to summon law enforcement. When my mother saw me approaching through the brightly lit lobby, her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated desperation. She pressed her face against the cold, wet glass, her mouth moving rapidly. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, stopping just a few inches away from the protective barrier. I stood safely behind the security glass, heavily pregnant and glowing with absolute peace. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at the miserable, soaked figures standing in the storm. Marcus reached over and pressed a small silver button on his desk, activating the two-way external intercom system so we could communicate without opening the heavy doors. Kendra. My mother wailed, her shrill, frantic voice crackling through the small lobby speaker. You have to let us inside right now. We are absolutely freezing out here. You have to help us. Please, Kendra. You must listen to me. I did not move a single muscle. I did not offer a sympathetic smile. I simply stared at them, completely devoid of any emotional attachment. Why are you here? I asked, my voice projecting through the intercom with cold, calculated precision. You are trespassing on private property. My father pushed his way toward the speaker, shoving my mother slightly aside. His face was a mask of pure, suffocating desperation. The bank is taking everything, Pastor Calvin shouted over the loud, crashing thunder. They are officially foreclosing on the house tomorrow morning. They froze all my remaining retirement accounts. The federal prosecutors are demanding millions in restitution and legal fees. We are going to lose our home. We are going to have absolutely nothing left. He pressed his wet, trembling hands against the thick glass, looking at me with wild, manic eyes. You have the money, Kendra, my father begged, completely abandoning his pride. You extracted your clean money before you sent that wire transfer. We know you have it securely hidden away. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting in your bank accounts. You have to wire it to our legal team immediately. You have to save your parents from this absolute catastrophe. You are our daughter. It is your ultimate duty to rescue your family. The sheer, unabashed audacity of his demand was genuinely breathtaking. Even after everything they had done, Even after they tried to use my name to launder stolen charity funds, they still believed they were entirely entitled to my hard-earned savings. They still viewed me as nothing more than a convenient disposable financial resource to fund their own corrupt survival. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed sharply through the grand, quiet lobby. Are you seriously standing out in a thunderstorm begging for the exact same money you tried to steal from me? I asked, shaking my head in pure disbelief. You tried to ruin my future. You tried to jeopardize my freedom. You sacrificed my entire life just so Chloe could play the role of a wealthy, spoiled housewife, and now you expect me to drain my personal savings to pay your federal legal fees. You are completely delusional. My mother slammed her fists against the glass again, her desperation rapidly transforming into vicious, unchecked rage. Her face contorted into an ugly, hateful snarl. We gave you life, Sister Yvonne screamed, her voice piercing and hysterical through the electronic speaker. You selfish, ungrateful child. We are facing federal prison because of your malicious, calculated trap. If you do not transfer those funds tonight, we will be sleeping on the streets. You cannot just abandon your own mother and father in their darkest hour. You have the power to fix this nightmare right now. Give us the money. I rested my hand gently on my pregnant belly, feeling an overwhelming surge of protective strength. I looked at the two miserable, corrupted people standing in the freezing rain, realizing I felt absolutely no pity for them. They had constructed their own spectacular downfall brick by brick, lie by lie. I am not giving you a single cent, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute unyielding finality. You made your choices. Now you get to face the devastating, unavoidable consequences. When the absolute reality of my refusal finally penetrated, her deeply panic-stricken mind, Sister Yvonne completely lost her grip on sanity. She began violently kicking the heavy security doors, her contorted face turning a terrifying shade of crimson. You are a monster! Sister Yvonne screamed, her shrill voice echoing wildly through the intercom system. You pushed your own family into the grave. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I looked directly into my mother's furious, tear-streaked eyes and offered her one final, completely devastating response. I smiled coldly. No, Mom. I just gave you the shovel. You did the digging yourself. I turned around and walked away, linking my arm securely with Andre's. We headed back toward the elevators without ever looking back, letting the security guard officially escort my screaming, ruined parents off the property forever. 6 months slipped by with a quiet, brilliant grace. The turbulent storm of federal investigations, dramatic indictments, and endless legal battles eventually faded into background noise, completely replaced by the soothing rhythm of our newly established reality. It was a warm, golden Friday evening when Andre and I drove up to a beautiful, sprawling suburban house. Jamal had invited us over for a celebratory home-cooked dinner. Walking through the freshly painted front door, the joyful sounds of my young niece and nephew immediately filled the air. They were running through the spacious hallways, laughing loudly, entirely free from the oppressive, toxic environment my family had previously forced upon them. Jamal emerged from the kitchen, wearing an apron, his face glowing with a profound, unburdened peace. He hugged us both tightly, expressing a depth of gratitude that required no words. During the peak of the fallout, I had quietly made a pivotal decision. The $120,000 of my completely clean, legally extracted personal savings had never been spent. Instead of hoarding it, I secretly sat down with a wealth management attorney and established an ironclad, irrevocable trust exclusively for my niece and nephew. I appointed Jamal as the primary trustee. Those funds provided the exact down payment he needed to secure this magnificent home and establish a rock-solid foundation for his children. He finally had full, uncontested legal custody. Chloe was completely out of the picture. Terrified of facing imminent federal prison time and legally barred from ever contacting her children due to her complicity in the massive fraud, my sister had simply vanished. She fled the state, running away like a coward in the night, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of federal debt and a ruined reputation. She traded her own flesh and blood for a cheap temporary illusion of wealth, and in the end, she lost absolutely everything. We sat around Jamal's large dining table, sharing an incredible meal, telling stories, and basking in the warmth of our chosen family. There was no judgment, no competition, and absolutely no manipulation. Just pure, authentic love. Only a few weeks after that beautiful dinner, I finally gave birth to a perfectly healthy, absolutely beautiful baby girl. Lying in the pristine, quiet hospital room, I cradled her tiny, fragile body against my chest. Her soft, rhythmic breathing was the most magnificent sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The atmosphere in the recovery suite was incredibly peaceful. It was completely free of the toxic, overbearing parents and entitled narcissistic siblings who used to aggressively dominate every single milestone of my existence. There were no fake smiles for cameras, no harsh criticisms disguised as helpful advice, and no subtle insults meant to diminish my joy. There was only Andre sitting closely by my side, gently stroking our daughter's head with tears of profound happiness shining brightly in his dark eyes. Jamal quietly entered the room shortly after bringing my niece and nephew to meet their new little cousin. The kids approached the bed with wide, curious eyes, whispering softly as they reached out to lightly touch the baby's tiny fingers. Jamal brought a massive, colorful bouquet of fresh flowers, setting them carefully on the windowsill. The room felt so rich, so abundant, and so completely full of genuine warmth. I looked around at the small, tightly knit group of people surrounding my hospital bed. This was my true family. We were bound not by toxic obligations or manipulative guilt trips, but by immense respect, mutual protection, and unwavering, absolute love. We had all walked through the raging fire of my parents' greed and my sister's devastating selfishness, and we had emerged stronger, united, and completely whole. The heavy chains of the past were permanently broken. My daughter would never know the cold sting of being the overlooked child. She would never have to buy her worth or prove her value to people who only loved conditionally. She would grow up surrounded by individuals who cherished her exactly as she was. Holding her securely, I felt a deep, powerful surge of unshakable clarity wash over my entire being. I stared down at the precious life resting quietly in my arms. I had spent countless years meticulously building a financial fortress just to shield myself from my own parents and their destructive schemes. I utilized numbers, data, and pure, unbreakable logic to ultimately sever the chains that had held me hostage since my childhood. Looking back at the unbelievable, staggering reality of the past year, I realized the most vital truth of my entire existence. I had to let them execute their own catastrophic demise. I had to step aside and simply allow their endless, insatiable greed to become their absolute, undeniable ruin. My father had literally handed over his entire life, his sprawling home, and his hard-earned pension just to fuel Chloe and her pathetic, superficial fantasies. They dug their own legal graves completely unprompted right in front of the federal authorities. They had nobody left to blame. I kissed my baby's soft forehead, feeling Andre wrap his strong arm around my shoulders. Jamal smiled brightly, watching his children giggle and play nearby. We had successfully created a magnificent, entirely bulletproof sanctuary for our future. The painful, devastating chapters of my past were permanently closed forever. I had successfully rewritten the narrative, transforming profound trauma into undeniable, ultimate victory. My newly forged life was just beginning, and it was absolutely flawless. I finally understood the profound power of walking away completely and permanently. I fully embraced the beautiful, resounding silence of my absolute perfect peace. Sometimes the only way to win a toxic game is to let them checkmate themselves. You can't heal in the same environment that broke you. Have you ever had to use the law to protect yourself from your own family? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving the unimaginable.